Thank you very, very much for inviting me to give this talk for the Herodotus Helpline. I'm absolutely delighted. I want to talk to you this evening or afternoon about a pivotal climactic moment in Herodotus' work, namely the account of the Persian siege of the Acropolis of Athens. And I would like to explore how this passage has been received in archaeology. This topic combines two of my research interests, namely Herodotus' account of the Persian Wars and the Acropolis of Athens as an archaeological site and magnet of ideologies and stories. I would like to expose how Herodotus' narrative about the siege has become a tool for the interpretation of the archaeology and history of the Acropolis. And in particular, I will discuss three theories about the Acropolis that incorporate elements of the siege account and perhaps even rely on it. And I then try to explain why these theories have become so popular in the end. And two possible reasons that I identify are, first, the authority of the archaeologists who created them, and second, the narrative that they offered to the Acropolis, namely the narrative of its downfall and rebirth. Now, I do not want to bring any new archaeological theory to the table, at least not now, and I do not necessarily want to pass judgment on the archaeological use of Herodotus' text. And really, I do not intend to say anything definitive at all. But I do want to raise an obvious question about the reliability of Herodotus for these endeavors. And I'm really looking forward to discussing that topic with you. But let's first read the famous text so that we are all on the same page. Since the crossing of the Hellespont, where the barbarians began their journey, they had spent 1 month there crossing into Europe, and in 3 more months were in Attica, when Calliades was archon at Athens. When they took the town, it was deserted, but in the sacred precinct, they found a few Athenians, stewards of the sacred precinct and poor people, who defended themselves against the assault by fencing the Acropolis with doors and logs. They had not withdrawn to Salamis, not only because of poverty, but also because they thought they had discovered the meaning of the oracle the Pythia had given, namely that the wooden wall would be impregnable. They believed that according to the oracle, this, not the ships, was the refuge. The Persians took up a position on the hill opposite the Acropolis, which the Athenians call the Areopagus, and besieged them in this way. They wrapped arrows in tar and set them on fire, and then shot them at the barricade. Still, the besieged Athenians defended themselves, although they had come to the utmost danger and their barricade had failed them. When the Pisistratids proposed terms of surrender, they would not listen, but contrived defenses, such as rolling down boulders onto the barbarians when they came near the gates. For a long time, Xerxes was at a loss, unable to capture them. But in time, a way out of their difficulties was revealed to the barbarians, since, according to the oracle, all the mainland of Attica had to become subject to the Persians. In front of the Acropolis and behind the gates in the ascent was a place where no one was on guard, since no one thought any man could go up that way. Here some men climbed up, near the sacred precinct of Cecrop's daughter Aglauros, although the place was a sheer cliff. When the Athenians saw that they had ascended to the Acropolis, some threw themselves off the wall and were killed, and others fled into the chamber. The Persians who had come up first turned to the gates, opened them, and murdered the suppliants. When they had leveled everything, they plundered the sacred precinct and set fire to the entire Acropolis. And so it was that Xerxes took complete possession of Athens, and he sent a horseman to Susa to announce his present success to Artabanos. On the day after the messenger was Athenian exiles who accompanied him and asked them to go up to the Acropolis and perform sacrifices in their customary way, an order given because he had been inspired by a dream or because he felt remorse after burning the sacred precincts. The Athenian exiles did as they were commanded. I will tell why I have mentioned this. In that Acropolis is a shrine of Erechtheus called the Earthborn, and in the shrine are an olive tree and a pool of salt water. The story among the Athenians is that they were set there by Poseidon and Athena as tokens when they contended for the land. It happened that the olive tree was burned by the barbarians with the rest of the sacred precinct, but on the day after its burning, when the Athenians ordered by the king to sacrifice went up to the sacred precinct, they saw a shoot of about a cubit's length sprung from the stump, and they reported this. Now, there are some other places in the work of Herodotus where he refers to the attack of the Persians. He talks about the fetters of the Chalcidians and the Boeotians hanging from the wall that the Persians scorched by fire opposite the west-facing temple hall, the Megaron. And in 913, there is talk of Mardonius' complete destruction of Athens, at least the part that had not been destroyed by Xerxes before. And then we also hear about a pre-Persian Athena sanctuary that is mentioned in the stories of Cylon and Cleomenes. Then, of course, this is what we can gather from Herodotus, but there are, of course, many glimpses of the pre-Persian Acropolis from other authors and inscriptions, which I cannot discuss now. But I would say that it was really Herodotus' account of the siege that we just read that would become to, and has become to posterity, both the most important source for the Persian attack on Athens and the most important guide to what had stood on the Acropolis before the magnificent rebuilding of Pericles. Now, there are many things to be deduced from this text that have become instrumental to archaeologists in interpreting what they find there. For example, the element in the story where the defenders use wood for protecting the Acropolis has led archaeologists to surmise that whatever stone wall they did find was either later or perhaps very old but obsolete. So for reasons of time, I would like to highlight only two important other clues that one could find in this text. First, there was at least one old temple dedicated to Athena when the Persians arrived. And when the Persians arrived, they burned the entire Acropolis. And Epresan Pazen ten Acropolin. One of the first scholars to engage with the text of Herodotus was Johannes van Meurs in 1622 already, when he compiled a learned collection of references to the Acropolis in his work, the Cecropia. He used the Herodotean passages to make some limited, abstract sense of the topography of the Acropolis. He had no real knowledge of the actual Acropolis. He had never traveled to Greece, but his work was very popular and it became foundational for later travelers such as Spon, Wheeler, Stewart, and Revet, and many others. When such classically trained Westerners started to arrive in Ottoman Athens, it was only a matter of time before they began to associate Herodotus' text with physical remains of the fortress. And this started simply by looking at the Acropolis. In the 18th century, the French archaeologist Julien David Leroy and a little bit later the diplomat Louis-François Sébastien Fauvel, pictured here, had identified the blocks in the face of the northern fortress wall of the Acropolis as belonging to the pre-Persian temple. And here they can be seen in a modern photograph. Later, following the addition of Athens to the growing independent Greek kingdom, the philologist Ludwig Ross examined part of the huge platform beneath the great temple known today as the Parthenon, concluding that it had been built for a pre-Persian temple. But that was not enough. Herodotus' text led to the expectation that evidence of the Persian vengeance that had obliterated the old Acropolis could still be found in the earth. Later in the 19th century, a young architect with bold new ideas arrived on the Athenian scene, and that was Wilhelm Dörpfeld. He is today still celebrated as an enormously productive and nearly scientific archaeologist in many prominent sites, such as Troy, Mycenae, and Olympia. But what is today sometimes overlooked is that he is also responsible for many of the archaeological ideas that we still have about the Acropolis. And I think that a lot of Herodotus went into those ideas. He is a key figure for my talk, so we will discuss him a little bit more. Dörpfeld's professional involvement with the Acropolis began in 1885 when he was appointed second secretary of the Athenian branch of the German Archaeological Institute in Athens, the DAI, or DAI. Within just 2 years, he became the first secretary, which really meant the director, a position he would hold for 25 years. And in this capacity, he oversaw the major excavations of the Acropolis from 1885 until 1890 by the Greek archaeologist Panayotis Kavadias and the German architect Georg Kawerau. This was not the first excavation of the Acropolis, but it was certainly the main one. And you can see here literally the soil being deposited on the south slope of the Acropolis that came from the fills of the Acropolis. Dürckfeld was not the official leader of the excavations, but they did take place under his auspices, and he considered himself the architectural consultant. As the excavations progressed, and long before the official publication of the finds in 1906, Dürckfeld wrote many interpretative articles about them in the main journal of the Dai, the Athenische Mitteilungen. And these complex essays placed the new discoveries in the context of the long-known textual sources and included much discussion on the reconstruction of the pre-Persian Acropolis. Dürckfeld was not named as the author of the excavation reports, but his work of previous years in the Athenische Mitteilungen is cited in the excavation report as authoritative. So let's look a little bit more at his actual theories, and they can be divided into three different theories. The first theory concerned the terrace in the middle of the Acropolis, directly south of the temple of the Caryatids. In the 19th century, the Caryatid temple, visible here, was still widely regarded as a sanctuary of Athena and Poseidon Erechtheus and called the Erechtheion, which we also just read about in Herodotus 8.55. At the time, most scholars also thought that part of the building was the so-called Archaios Neos, the ancient temple, the sanctuary of the ancient wooden statue of Athena. But in 1885, Dürckfeld decided that the walls on the terrace just to the south of the Caryatid temple should be fully exposed, which also happened in 1886. But before the shovels hit the ground, Dürckfeld already published an article in the Athenische Mitteilungen of 1885, in which he concluded what the foundation had been. This, not the Caryatid temple, was the Archaios Neos, the ancient temple of Athena. Dürckfeld's discovery is considered one of the highlights of his career, but earlier thinking about the foundation was swept under the rug. Dürckfeld ignored an earlier excavation of the site by Karl Buttiger and did not address another early interpretation, still tenable today, that the foundation was dedicated to the memory of the ancient kings of Athens. The same article of 1885 also contained a second theory on the Persian destruction. It concerned the blocks built into the north wall of the Acropolis as spoils or spolia. And you can see on the top of the slide blocks of mainly porous, a local limestone, and on the bottom of the slide, you can see unfinished marble column drums. As I mentioned, Leroy and Fauvel and others had already associated these blocks with the pre-Persian temple known from Herodotus. Dürckfeld's contribution, however, was that the material did not belong to one single temple, but had to be divided over two different temples. The limestone material on the top here was the temple that went on the newly discovered foundation. But the marble column drums had to be assigned to a hitherto unknown, completely disappeared building, which was all marble and also unfinished. And he called this temple the Ältere Parthenon, so the older Parthenon, and it is also known as the pre-Parthenon in current modern archaeological theory. Now, this older Parthenon is said to have been under construction on the south side of the Acropolis before the project was abandoned and replaced by Pericles' Parthenon that still exists today. Dürckfeld initially dated the older Parthenon after the Persian in the 460s under the command of Kimon. But 17 years later, in 1902, Dürckfeld published a new article with a surprising plot twist for the older Parthenon that perplexed all of his colleagues at the time, primarily on the basis of alleged fire damage in the architectural remains. that had been assigned to this older Parthenon, he now argued that the temple had been destroyed in a great Persian inferno, and that the beginning of its construction must therefore necessarily be dated to the pre-Persian period, that is, before 480. His conclusion was, "Der ältere Parthenon ist vorpersisch." The older Parthenon is pre-Persian. And with that remark, there were now suddenly two Athena temples that had been destroyed by the Persians. So on the one hand, on the foundation that he had discovered, he placed the Archaios Neos, and on the south foundation of the Parthenon, there had stood an earlier Parthenon, the older Parthenon, and both of these temples had been destroyed by the Persians. Dörpfeld's third theory of Persian destruction developed on the basis of the extraordinary finds made during the major excavations. In these excavations appeared many objects, including pottery and broken sculptures. The immediate conclusion was that these objects had been present on the Acropolis when the Persians attacked. And along with the temples, they were violently destroyed and later buried by the Athenians shortly after the war. It was Dörpfeld who, in 1887, christened the newly found material Perserschutt, Persian debris. Now, in the same article in Athenische Mitteilung of 1887, where he talks about the Perserschutt, he makes a very important methodological step that underpins not only the Perserschutt theory, but also the others. And I want to present it to you here. Herodotus describes to us how the Persians, during their 2 stays in Athens, set fire to and destroyed almost all the buildings of the lower city and the castle. Only the houses in which the Persian leaders lived were spared. With the numerous buildings and works of art of the citadel, our temple, which he means here the Archaios Neos on the foundation, excavated in 1886, that temple also perished at the time. The total destruction of the citadel is eloquently demonstrated by the statues and architectural elements that have now emerged from the rubble. Everything that could be broken was smashed. The columns overturned, everything that could be burned was set on fire, and everything that was precious was stolen. The traces of the flames can still be seen clearly on many works of art and architectural pieces. Dörpfeld's 3 theories were highly successful. They earned him the Royal Gold Medal for Architecture from the Royal British Institute of Architects in 1911. The central principles of the theories are in most aspects still accepted by many today. And with these theories, the year 480 BCE, the year in which Herodotus dates the Persian attack in the archonship of Kaliadis, now became manifest as a turning point of the archaic and classical period in the development of Greek sculpture, and also a dating mechanism for archaeological context throughout the Greek world. And if you ever venture into the wondrous world of Greek archaeology, just note how often you encounter the year 480 or terms like pre-Persian or post-Persian in order to make some chronological sense of any kind of object, not just in Athens, but basically everywhere. Now, why have these theories become so popular? A key ingredient of this success seems to have been Dörpfeld himself, in particular his authority as one of the founders of modern archaeology. The cult of his genius began early and took quite extreme forms. The superlatives bestowed upon Dörpfeld were really extraordinary. For example, he was called the Altmeister, so the old master, or the Stammesheros, the tribal hero, and even the Nestor of archaeology. Dörpfeld's friend and biographer, Peter Güssler, declared in 1951 that Dörpfeld's persona represents the pinnacle of classical archaeology itself. In addition, Dörpfeld was a source of German nationalism and patriotism. Because he uncovered so many prominent sites and buildings, he contributed to the era of German Großarchäologie, so big archaeology, like few others had done. Even after the Second World War, the patriotic view that Dörpfeld had been an ambassador of Germany continued unabated. And it's still with us today. And I think it has become even more after in recent years. Another cornerstone of Dörpfeld's success lies in the wide recognition of his methodological innovation as a pioneer of modern archaeology. Dörpfeld is credited with the first production of objective architectural history, made possible by an almost mathematical, logical way of thinking and by the observation of details in architecture and stratigraphy. This reputation of an empirical observer grew on the fertile soil of his training in architecture at the prestigious Bauakademie in Berlin. The status grew further through a rather easy contrast with his controversial mentor Heinrich Schliemann, who was then and still today considered a troublesome treasure hunter with no academic qualifications. The more Schliemann was condemned as a destructive parvenu, the more Dörpfeld emerged as a productive hero. And today he is still admired as a great modernizer of archaeology. But if you investigate individual theories, you'll find a quite different legacy of his work. Dörpfeld was heavily criticized for basically everything that he published. Well known in this respect are his theories about the location of Ithaca, and he believed that that was located in the island of Lefkas. The trouble here, and in many of his theories, also those of the Acropolis, was that they depended on his desire to find real, tangible evidence for multi-interpretable and often contradictory texts, such as Homeric epic. In this, he did not differ from Schliemann, who was equally captivated by such textual mirage. His methodology was heavily criticized by leading historians and philologists, including Theodor Mommsen and Ulrich von Wilamowitz-Müllendorf, who scorned Dörpfeld as a simple architect who could not really penetrate the alien world of antiquity and ignored arguments that could disprove his theories. And there's one citation of Wilamowitz who scathingly remarks, Dörpfeld ignores all grammar, all criticism, all history, except when something suits him. And the British archaeologist Sylvia Benton described Dörpfeld succinctly in a review as a man who read texts and excavated to prove them true. She used the past tense as if he was already deceased, even though he was at the time still alive and lurking in his own Ithaca to work on his Acropolis book that never appeared. Now, Dörpfeld's method of excavating texts was not necessarily incorrect, because it is still, of course, possible that you can find material that corresponds to the world of ancient texts. And we know all of these examples from Herodotus, of course, where this is true. And also in the case of the Acropolis, you can say that. But we have been warned that care is needed when we are applying texts to archaeology. And indeed, we have to reassess this relationship again, especially, of course, then Herodotus' sensational account of the Persian siege. Because this short text may have been the sine qua non for Dörpfeld's theories. Well, this is actually a question that I have. If this text had not been handed down to posterity, if Herodotus had never written those words, enepris and pasenten Acropolin, would there have been reason to discern any evidence of Persian destruction on the Acropolis in the first place? Could it have been identified without the text? We will never know, perhaps, but it is a question I have. In any case, Dörpfeld regarded the histories as a historical yardstick for his new discoveries. His confidence was not at all eccentric, because unlike the poetry of Homer, Herodotus' historiography of the Persian Wars was then still considered a reliable source for events in the Greek world. The scholarly realization that Herodotus was not an infallible guide to those wars may have been growing at the time already, but the account of the siege of the Acropolis in particular has never really been questioned. Now, was Dörpfeld's application of Herodotus methodologically sound? We are now more aware that the relationship of the historical past to Herodotus' text on the Persian invasion, which could easily have included or have been influenced by memory and story formation, is less straightforward than previously thought. And I would like to mention here the very important work of Giorgia Proietti, who has just published an entire book on that topic. And I would like to mention the work of Irene de Jong, who is writing a narratological commentary on Herodotus and exposing it, as of course many others have done as well, as a literary masterwork. And About the narration of the Persian siege, she has let me know that she is treating it as schematized, and she compares it to the siege of Sardis and Babylon, which proceed in more or less the same fashion. Now, I understand that this is a very controversial point, and of course, I'm not saying that reliable historical information could not have gone into the text that has come down to us. And for one thing, we know that most, if not all of the places that Herodotus mentions in Greece actually existed. But we have to be very careful whether the stories that are told at these locations are historically authentic, especially because we know that stories can crystallize around places of memory. That's actually a very well-known phenomenon. And particularly the Acropolis is prone to attracting stories and plays a role in all kinds of ideologies throughout its history. And I put some publications here that give insight into that process. In general, we now know that archaeologists can be excellent storytellers and that material remains frequently asked for narrative explanations. These narratives are sometimes considered historically authentic, but they can, like any narrative, be embellished, exaggerated, or invented. In this process, archaeologists may play a role because they can authoritatively present and preserve material culture as providing the very evidence of a tale's veracity and historicity. But I would say that when narratives start to entangle physical remains, there also exists a risk of confirmation bias, because a necessary but often unasked question is whether material remains can indeed prove the historicity of a story, or whether they only have a reality effect. And again, this doesn't mean at all that archaeologists jumped to conclusions and that they were all wrong, far from it. But I think that these studies should sensitize us to the possibility of this, the existence of stories in archaeological studies. Now, there does seem to be a risk of confirmation bias in Dürpfeld's Acropolis theories, for the general conclusion was identical to the assumption that the Persian attack recounted by Herodotus had left unmistakable material traces. And so the material traces became then evidence that the text of Herodotus was correct. Circularity in reasoning does not necessarily lead to wrong conclusions, but all three theories prove problematic on other grounds as well. And in a recent article, I argue that Dürpfeld's identification of the Dürpfeld Foundation at the bottom of the slide right now with the Archaios Neos may be incorrect. Second, thorough studies of the objects and contexts of the so-called Persershoot by Astrid Lindenlauf and Martin Steskal have shown that the concept is at least partially misleading, because the conclusion that the broken sculptures suffered from Persian aggression, that conclusion is actually not that certain. And the use of Persershoot as a dating mechanism, because it has turned into a dating mechanism, that should be avoided. That's at least what Steskal says, since the deposition of the terraces where these sculptures were found cannot be dated precisely. And next week, I'm actually organizing a conference in which we will re-examine 480 BCE as this all-important watershed moment in Greek archaeology and history. Of the three theories, Dürpfeld's idea about the date of the older Parthenon may have been the most controversial. Toward the end of his life, Dürpfeld complained that he, a Bauforscher, an architectural historian with 50 years of research on this temple, had failed to convince all his colleagues of his opinion on it. And he was here referring to criticism from the historian Walter Kolbe, who again saw the temple as not pre-Persian, but post-Persian, and therefore, of course, not destroyed by the Persians. Kolbe concluded his study with the provocative statement, "The pre-Persian older Parthenon belongs in the realm of legends." And Dürpfeld was enraged. According to Kolbe, the scientific mainstream had accepted the pre-Persian date of the older Parthenon as an axiom, not by looking at the evidence itself, but by yielding to Dürpfeld's authority as the Altmeister of archaeology. Kolbe did not cry out in the wilderness, because his refutation of the pre-Persian dating of the older Parthenon was continued and confirmed by the architect Arnold Chira, who showed in a series of articles that actually no fire damage can be recognized in the marble. Dörpfeld was again enraged, but he died in 1940 before he could refute Chira. And for several decades, the debate over the existence of the pre-Persian older Parthenon continued while the evidence for Persian fire remained controversial. But from the 1980s onwards, the Greek architect Manolis Korres began to argue that the pre-Persian dating of the older Parthenon was indisputable by claiming again that the fracture of the blocks attributed to the temple was caused by a major fire. And in his view, can only have been done by the Persians. This is a drawing of the destruction of the older Parthenon by Korres himself, including a proud Persian standing on a column of the older Parthenon. Korres is in many circles a widely respected authority, and his theories have actually never been questioned. And thus, the waters closed over the critical reflection by Kolbe and Chira, and Dörpfeld's theory was reinstated. However, irrefutable scientific evidence that the blocks were actually broken by fire is still forthcoming, or at least I haven't found it. In fact, the breaking of the blocks has many other possible explanations. And even if the blocks really were broken by fire, archaeology will never be able to determine whether that fire was Persian. Now, whether or not these theories are correct, that's not the question of today, but we may ask another question. Why have these become so popular despite all of the controversies? Apart from Dörpfeld's almost sacrosanct authority, I would like to identify another relevant aspect, the story of Hellas' destruction and rebirth. And we can already discern this in Herodotus' text. When following the destruction, the Greeks offer to the gods of the Acropolis, they see that the burnt olive tree grows again, and that seems to herald the Greek victory in the Battle of Salamis. The idea of rebirth or anagenesis from the ashes became archaeologically manifest with Dörpfeld's theories. And now I think that this also fits very well in the ideological climate of the time. Some background. Because the Persian destruction of Athens, as told by Herodotus, was an important historical beacon in the international academic milieu of Dörpfeld's time and long after. And this was, of course, influenced by the ideology that we call Philhellenism, the love of Greece. The Greek War of Independence and subsequent conflicts with the Ottoman Empire led to the founding of the Greek state. And as examined by Susan Marchant, Philhellenism swelled into a widespread institutional ideology in the areas that we now call Germany in the 19th century. In Greece, Germany, and elsewhere, Philhellenism's glorification of Hellas went hand in hand with its condemnation of Eastern societies for their historical engulfment of Greece. And these cultures were often denied the qualities of rationality, ingenuity, and love of freedom, for these were typically intended for the ancient Greeks and their European heirs, especially, of course, the Germans. In the mirror of history, the War of Independence reflected as the Persian invasion of 480-479, since both conflicts were fought by Greeks against Eastern enemies whose territories largely overlapped. This particular view of history also emphasizes the multiple devastations and subsequent rebirths of Greece. Just as the ancient Greek city-states were saved after the expulsion of Xerxes' armies in the battles of Salamis and Plataea, the Greek state was reborn when it finally shook off the Turkish yoke. Now, I recently visited the National Historical Museum in Athens, and you can find that parallelism everywhere. A case in point is this amazing Acroproro, a figurehead of a ship, of a 19th century warship, shaped like Themistocles. There are many others. They have, I think, Leonidas and so on. And I think that this is a reminder that in the 19th century, it was really felt that history was repeating itself. For once again, ancient Greek generals sailed the waters again to repel the Easterners. In this Philhellenic ideological climate, the Athenian Acropolis, destroyed in both the Persian and Ottoman wars, developed into the most powerful symbol of the ancient and modern resurrection of Greece. The abstract story of destruction and rebirth became concrete with the work of German Philhellenes, such as Leon von Klenze and Ludwig Ross. Because when they arrived in Athens, that was now ruled by the Bavarians, they brought with them the Philhellenic hope of reviving the dusty, war-torn city that Athens then was. And the first thing they started doing was to rebuild the Parthenon in an effort to raise the Greek phoenix once again. And if you don't believe how pervasive this phoenix symbolism was, then just visit this National Historical Museum in Athens, and you can see actual phoenixes on everywhere on emblems and on flags of the insurgency. And this is an astonishing parade boat of the new Bavarian king of the Hellenes, Otto von Wittelsbach himself. So he was literally being carried over the waters by a phoenix. For this phoenix symbolism too, as I already indicated, Herodotus provided a foundational narrative. For upon the Athenians' return to their destroyed citadel, they noted that Athena's sacred olive tree, though also burned with the rest of the sanctuary, had miraculously sprouted again. The implication of the legend is that hope of the city's imminent resurrection was already sprouting among the ashes of the old Acropolis. The symbolism of the Herodotean narrative was so strong that the Greek historian Dimitrios Kambourolou wrote that the olive tree of the Acropolis was burned again in the war with the Ottomans, but had miraculously grown back afterwards. And he thus reiterated Herodotus' old legend, but disregarded the fact that no tree grew here at all at the time of the war. The modern one was actually planted by the American archaeologist Bert Hodge Hill in 1912. But according to a news article, it was then later destroyed by a storm. And so later it was, according again to unconfirmed sources, replanted by Queen Sofia, the current Queen of Spain. But there's also a website that says that it was actually the Germans in the Second World War who first destroyed it before it was replanted by Queen Sofia. So again, you see that this olive tree becomes an anchor for all kinds of stories about which the historicity is difficult to verify. Now, what I think is of some relevance is that Dörpfeld himself ascribed to this phoenix symbolism. When he acquired his senior position at the DAI in 1885, he built on the foundations laid by his Grecophile predecessors. His career and Geist symbolized Germany's inner unity with Hellas, as he described it. As chairman of the Committee of the Restoration of the Parthenon, he continued the material resurrection of the temple, and we can find his signature under all the reports of that committee. In recognition of his efforts to raise Greece's international prestige, the Hellenic state awarded him the Grand Cross in the Order of the Phoenix in 1933, the very symbol of Greece's rebirth. Dörpfeld was especially Philhellenic in his diligent scientific search for the material world of ancient Greece, but he was not immune to the political positions of Philhellenism. He was sympathetic to the continuation of the Greek conquests of Bulgarian and Turkish territories. And even more remarkably, the Greek struggle against the Persians became a proxy for the German struggle against their many enemies in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s and 40s. In a letter to the German Greek Society in Athens in December 1914 that we see here, he accused the United Kingdom and France of imperialism and the racial mixing of their forces. And it seems that he saw there a resemblance of the British and French forces with the multi-ethnic army of the Persian king Xerxes that is vividly described by Herodotus, as we all know. And he contrastingly described the German army as the armed people trained and equipped to defend the fatherland, the army of citizens, the same spirit that millennia ago fought the victorious battles against the Persians in Hellas. What a German poet and patriot said 100 years ago is still true. In the German camp, one fights for freedom and humanity, for Europe, not with the heirs of Napoleon and the Persian great kings. Ultimately, the relevance of the theories lay not in the personal thought of their prominent advocate, but rather in their broader effect beyond ivory towers. With Dörpfeld's endorsement, the theories offered archaeological evidence for Herodotus' account of the destruction of Athens. making an already strong Philhellenic narrative tangible and seemingly unquestionable. Modern Athens is filled with purported mementos of the 480 BCE calamity. For example, from 1956 until the year 2000, every night the Acropolis became the decor of the so-called Son et Lumière, or sound and light show, that recounted the story of the Persian invasion of the Acropolis and the triumph of the Athenians over their Eastern enemies, which were also stereotyped, of course, as quintessentially evil. But it was a direct telling of Herodotus' story. The new Acropolis Museum contains a forest of mutilated sculptures of the Persian. And despite the doubt in modern scholarship about the validity of that concept, a video screen was added to the museum room in 2021, just last year, directed by the museum itself. And it shows Persians in Oriental costumes aggressively pulling the sculptures from their pedestals to smash them to pieces. Without mentioning Herodotus, the video very effectively brings Herodotus' narrative to the museum room and imbues the silent sculptures with it. Perhaps the most enduring reception of Herodotus' text looms as we view the Acropolis from the north. The facade contains the marble column drums assigned to the older Parthenon. Dirkveld's ideas led one to assume that these blocks had been intentionally placed in the north wall of the Acropolis to serve as a mahnmal, or a kind of warning monument of Persian destruction, so that posterity would not forget the sacrilege of the barbarians. It has even been said that the temples rise above it like a phoenix from the ashes of the Acropolis. Even if Herodotus or any other source never talks about this wall, the story of rebirth in the archaeological ensemble has permeated modern scholarship. A leading book on the Acropolis, for example, describes the wall as a moving display of ruins high above the city of Athens, a looming testimony to Persian sacrilege, an eternal lament. In the lower city, the eternal lament reappears in the monument of the unknown soldier in front of the Greek parliament on Syntagma Square, designed by 3 Greek artists and built in the 1930s. This cenotaph incorporates replicas of ancient column drums in its flanks, and they mimic the drums in the north wall of the Acropolis and can be taken as a solemn commemoration of Greek democracy's rebirth from its ashes following ancient and modern wars. Looking at the column drums in this monument and those in the north wall of the Acropolis, we can begin to understand the reason for the popularity of the Persian destruction theories. They were a prerequisite for the assignment of historical meaning to these stones. Without these theories, Herodotus' text evaporates from the marble. I'll get to my conclusion. As we have seen, Herodotus' reflection of the pre-Persian Acropolis, and particularly the 4-word phrase "enepresan pasen ten Acropolin," they burned the entire Acropolis, still resonates with us and has suffused the marble quite literally. The visibility of the Persian destruction won from all the competing views, even if these competing views relied on good arguments. Now, I'm not saying that any of these theories are right or wrong, because that's not what I wanted to do in this talk. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't apply Herodotus to the Acropolis at all. For all I'm concerned, I actually do think that a good case can be made that some of the buildings were destroyed, but I do call for nuance. It's a matter of trying hard to find out what exactly stood on the Acropolis in 480, how pervasive the destruction was, and how we can recognize that destruction in the actual blocks and sculptures. More generally, we must acknowledge that any archaeological theory can be fallible, especially where they have texts built in. And thus we should perhaps be warned that Herodotus' text cannot have an absolute monopoly on the interpretation of the Acropolis. Thank you very much for your attention.